2,500 people. That is roughly how many human beings live across the 10 towns in this video, combined, by the last count, give or take a few names on a roll that barely gets checked. You could seat that many in a single suburban high school gymnasium and still find spare chairs. One of these towns paints a joke about its own name on the wall of an abandoned hospital, and nobody has ever bothered to take it down. One of these towns sits beside a giant figure cut into the earth, so precise it had to be measured with GPS, and nobody, not the council, not the police, not one living soul, has ever admitted to making it. And one of these towns buries its own houses, on purpose, before it buries anything else. None of that is why these places matter. What matters is the thing none of those three stories can explain. After the mines closed, after the missions closed, after the floods and the fires, and the 400-kilometre round trip for a jar of Vegemite, somebody stayed. Not because they had nowhere else to go. Most of them did. They stayed because somewhere out here they put roots down, and roots, once they take, do not let go easily. This is the story of 10 towns where the roots won. Start in South Australia, on the Oodnadatta track at the smallest town in the state. William Creek has 6 residents. 6. And a dog. It sits inside the boundary of Anna Creek Station, the largest working cattle property on the planet. One paddock alone is bigger than some small countries, and the town itself is basically a rounding error on its own farm. There's a corrugated iron pub, a runway, and not much else. No river. No highway. No reason, on paper, for a human being to plant themselves here rather than anywhere with air conditioning and a supermarket. And yet 6 people wake up in William Creek every single morning and choose it again. Out here, apparently, 6 people and a dog is enough for a route to hold. Follow the Nullarbor Plain west and the routes get stranger. Cook was built in 1917 to service the world's longest dead straight stretch of railway, 478 kilometres without a single bend. At its peak, more than 50 workers lived here, with a hospital, a school, and a swimming pool carved out of the driest plain in the country. Then, in 1997, the railway was privatised. The new owners didn't need a support town. Almost overnight, Cook went from a working settlement to 4 permanent residents, all railway workers, waiting out their shifts between trains. Every drop of drinking water still arrives by rail car. There is no other way in. And on the wall of the old bush hospital, someone long ago painted the town's unofficial slogan, and nobody has taken it down. If you're a crook, come to Cook. It's a joke 4 people still tell each other, alone, in the middle of a plain with nothing on it, for hundreds of kilometres in every direction. The railway left. The joke stayed. So did they. 200 kilometres inland, Marree sits at the exact crossroads of 2 of the most punishing routes in the country, the Birdsville track and the Oodnadatta track. Camel trains once passed through here by the 100, driven by Afghan cameleers who built South Australia's outback trade routes, and left behind a small mosque that still stands on the edge of town. 65 people live in Marree now, and just north of it, cut into the red earth, is a giant figure of a man, visible only from the air, so exact in its proportions that surveyors have measured it down to the centimetre. It appeared sometime in the 1990s. Nobody has ever come forward to claim it. Not the artist, not the funder, not one name in 30 years. The town below it lives with that mystery the way it lives with everything else out here, without needing it solved. The roots don't require an explanation. They just need water, once in a while, and something worth staying for. Cross into Queensland's Channel Country and the heat gets the final word. Birdsville sits on the edge of the Simpson Desert, roughly 1,600 kilometres from Brisbane, where summer temperatures have topped 49 degrees. A little over 100 people live here, servicing cattle stations the size of small nations and running one of the most famous pubs in the outback. The roads in are unsealed for hundreds of kilometres. Heavy rain can cut Birdsville off completely. Weeks, sometimes. And still, every September, this town of about 100 people hosts a horse race that pulls in thousands of visitors who camp in the dust because there's nowhere else to sleep for half a day's drive. A town this hot, this hard to reach, this small, shouldn't be able to fill a race weekend. But the roots here aren't just in the ground. They're in a date on a calendar that the whole town builds itself around, year after year, whether the visitors come or not. Innamincka has been abandoned once already. In 1952, drought and isolation emptied it out completely. No shops, no pub, no people, just buildings standing empty on the banks of Cooper Creek. For almost 20 years, it was a ghost town in the fullest sense of the word. Then oil and gas turned up in the Cooper Basin, and in the 1970s, people came back. Not many. Somewhere between 12 and 20, depending on the year and who's counting. They rebuilt a hotel inside the old abandoned one. They reopened a heritage nursing home as a visitor centre. They chose, a second time, a town that had already failed once. That's a different kind of root than the others on this list, one that was pulled entirely out of the ground, and someone planted it back anyway. In the far northwest corner of New South Wales, granite boulders erupt straight out of the footpaths of a town regularly named the hottest place in the state on the evening weather report. 95 people live in Tibooburra, in a landscape so remote that the sealed road from Broken Hill wasn't finished until 2020. Inside the family hotel, the walls are covered in murals by the painter Clifton Pugh, done in exchange for beer during long outback stopovers, an original piece of Australian art, hanging in a pub with fewer regulars than most inner-city bars have staff. Down the street, there's a drive-in cinema. In a town of 95, nobody needs a drive-in cinema in a town of 95 people. Nobody needs an original painting on a pub wall out here either. They built them anyway, because roots don't just hold a place together. Sometimes they insist on beauty, for no reason except that beauty was worth the effort. Now, the third mystery. Andamooka was built on opal, discovered in 1930, and at its peak in the 1960s, it held more than 2,000 people chasing colour out of the dirt. Today, it's closer to 260. But the strangest choice this town ever made wasn't about mining. It was about housing. Andamooka has almost no reliable water of its own. Every drop still has to be trucked or piped in from a town 15 kilometres away. And rather than fight the desert heat with air conditioning, generations of residents dug their homes straight into the hillsides instead. 2/3 underground, 1/3 stone and tin, cool in summer, warm in winter, and completely invisible from the road until you're standing on the roof of somebody's living room. They buried their houses before they buried anything else out here, and they kept living in them for nearly a century, because a hole in a hillside that holds its temperature turned out to be worth more than 4 walls above the ground ever were. In Arnhem Land, in the Northern Territory, roughly 1,200 people live in Gunbalanya, also known as Oenpelli, on the eastern edge of Kakadu. For up to 5 months of the year, the wet season floods the East Alligator River, and the town is cut off by road entirely. The only crossing point, Cahill's Crossing, fills with saltwater crocodiles at high tide. Locals cross it anyway, it's the only way out. And on the escarpment above the town, artists are still painting, using techniques and stories connected to a rock art tradition that stretches back tens of thousands of years, one of the longest unbroken artistic traditions anywhere on Earth. Isolation didn't end that culture. It's arguably the reason it's still intact. Cut off by water for 1/3 of every year, guarded by crocodiles at the only way through. And still, this is one of the only places on the continent where the roots have never once been disturbed. West, into the Gibson Desert, 1,600 kilometres from Perth, past the point where the bitumen runs out completely. Warburton is home to around 500 people, mostly Nganya Chara, on a stretch of the Great Central Road so remote it's nicknamed Australia's longest shortcut. Inside this desert community sits the Chuluru Cultural and Civic Centre, home to what's said to be the largest collection of community-controlled Aboriginal art anywhere in the world. A world-class gallery built and run by the community itself, standing in a town with no traffic lights, no supermarket chain, and a 560-kilometre gravel road as its only link to a sealed highway. The further you get from everything, it seems, the more some communities insist on building something worth the distance. Warburton didn't wait for the roads to arrive before it decided its roots were worth investing in. Last, back to South Australia, to the one place on this list where staying was never supposed to be possible. In the early 1950s, The Anangu people living around Aldea were forced off their land to make way for British nuclear testing at Marree. Trucks and coaches moved entire families hundreds of kilometres to a new mission called Yalata, with no warning and no consultation. Roadblocks and soldiers made sure nobody went back. For decades, the connection to that original country was supposed to be over. Severed, uprooted, in the most literal sense the word allows. 313 people live in Yalata today, on the Nullabore's southern edge, most of them descendants of the families who were moved there against their will. Some, over the years, walked back toward Marree anyway, defying the checkpoints built to keep them out. The mission became a community the moment local people took over its administration for themselves in the 1970s, and it has stayed a community on its own terms ever since. You can force people off land. Governments here did exactly that. What you cannot always do is force the roots to die with them. Sometimes they just grow back somewhere else, angrier, older, and unmistakably still theirs. 10 towns, 2,500 people, give or take. A joke on a hospital wall that 4 people still tell each other. A giant figure in the dirt that nobody will claim. A row of houses buried in a hillside on purpose. None of it explains why anyone stays. All of it proves that they do. Because the real story of the Australian outback was never about who left. It's about the roots too stubborn to come out of the ground. Even after the mines shut. Even after the missions closed. Even after a government itself once tried to pull them up by the root and move them somewhere else entirely. The empty land has told you why towns die. This time, it's telling you why some of them refuse to.